To begin with, I would like to welcome you to Managing Difficult Conversations in your class as part of Ready to Teach Week. Let's begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands in which we are meeting today and recognise that this has always been a place of learning and sharing of cultures for a long time, long before the establishment of UQ. I'd like to extend my gratitude to the elders past and present for their care and custodianship of the country. I'd like to also welcome any First Nation participants joining today and thank you to those for your continued contribution to Australian and global society. This session is a collaboration of a number of team members, and I will introduce everybody to you. Once we start the session, each person is going to speak to a particular topic that is important to them, that they've navigated through, and provide you with some tips of what's taken place in terms of what does a difficult conversation look like, and then some tools to help you manage the difficult conversations when it takes place and what you can do after that conversation has taken place. But let me introduce the team who's going to bring that to you. We have Nikita Testa. Nikita works very passionately with the UQ Art Gallery and uses a range of different techniques to ensure that there is mutual exchange and understanding. Cho Singh, he's a health psychologist and has been an award-winning university educator and works with some very sensitive contents and with some learners from diverse backgrounds. Culturally and professionally. So he's bringing his expertise of how to have those conversations and what that can look like. Dr. Christina Golit. Christina teaches the first year students within education in a compulsory course. And the course is all about having the students question the educational success that they have had to date, and then looking at how that has taken place without upsetting them and looking at the biases within that. We have Amber Forsyth, learning designer within HAS in Italy. And I'm Tanya Henry, for those of you whom I have not yet met. I'm a learning designer within Italy. And behind the scenes, we have my colleague Peter Rutherford, who is managing all the chats and making sure that everything works from a technical point of view. Before we get started, I would like to recognise that this session will include some topics that some people may find uncomfortable. Throughout the session, if you are triggered by anything that is being presented, we completely understand and will encourage you to take a break from the session if you feel uncomfortable at any point in time. There are a series of self-care tips that we're going to be talking about at the end of the session to ensure that people know how to care for yourself and care for others should you experience anything that you are uncomfortable with. Nikita, can you please talk about some of the things that we or others may have experienced as a way of introducing this session, please?
Sure. Can everybody hear me before I kick off? Thumbs up emojis would be great.
Nice and clear, Nikia.
Thank you. We want to kick off this session with a focus on, I guess, agency and this idea of mutual exchange among the presenters and the participants. And we would love to gauge your experiences as the participants. And there's just a few prompts there on the screen. And so as I move through each one, if you'd like to participate by either adding a comment into the chat or pressing the thumbs up emoji if you have experienced one of these, any of these particular types of scenarios, that would be amazing. So the first one there is having overheard a student in your class perhaps make a racist, homophobic, misogynistic or anti-religious comment or insult. Anybody wants to jump in there? regular feature in philosophy classes. Thanks, Luke.
So if it's needed, or you can just use a thumbs up. You don't have to put a comment in chat. If you've experienced any of these things, just a thumbs up so we can recognize that these things take place.
So that second one there, have you ever had difficulty being able to respond to inappropriate comments in class because you felt unsure? How to respond? Interesting classism. Thanks, Linda. Do you find it difficult perhaps to be an ethical bystander in your class because you feel or you may think that you don't have the tools or skills to speak up? And that last one, have you been the victim of racist or discriminatory comments from the students during the course of your class? That is a really tough space. We really want to give you some skills and some support today in this session. So I'm really sorry if you've actually experienced that as a lecturer or a tutor here. But yeah, that's just a little way to gauge how everybody might be tracking through this kind of experience in your classes. Thanks for participating, everyone.
Yeah. So many of us have experienced many of these things, either in the classroom or perhaps further afield. And today's session, as I mentioned previously, is about identifying what does this look like? If it takes place in a classroom, what can it look like? And how can we respond, whether that is a comment or a feeling that is aimed at us as teaching staff, or whether it's something that's aimed at another student, and what can we do? Like, how do we actually respond to that? So I'm going to ask Christina to share her thoughts. She's been working in this space for some time. So Christina.
Thanks, Tanya. Hello, everyone. My name's Christina. I'm in the School of Education. My pronouns are she, her, they, and them. Just to set the scene, I teach a large first year, first semester compulsory sociology of education subject. And so this course is all about getting students to question and to take pause on the educational structures that they have participated in and have actually had a lot of success in. So in essence, the extension of that is to get them to question their privilege. So I'm constantly in the space of having to navigate what's difficult. And I guess I wanted to take a second to think about what this concept of difficult is. And so in the diagram I have in front of you, when we think about difficulties and these difficult dynamics in the classroom, we often think about them in terms of learning theory as either being clashing with what you have experienced or what you believe about the world or feel you know about the world. So very much the content. Difficult in terms of hard to understand. So it might be something that people just are struggling to grapple with. And so those two sides of the same coin may actually feed into each other. But what that ends up happening, I guess, is that people can become in the classroom, teachers included, defensive and or disinterested. And we really want to shy away from being in the blue. And we want to try and think about staying in the orange. So I guess I think about this as being a challenging environment, not so much a difficult environment. And it's challenging because we have to think differently about what we're doing or how we approach it pedagogically, so we can help everyone, student and teacher, acquire new knowledge and skills. So how do we get to stay in the orange? Tanya, next slide, please. So my approach to this is using what we call a pedagogy of discomfort. And so what that is all about is teaching your students to identify and use emotions to help them make sense of where they are at with their learning journey. And Joanne Bowler has written a fabulous book about this. So in the sociology of education, this kind of isn't a new issue. It's been around for a really long time because we tend to teach quite polemic topics. And so we've had to really think about how we approach this, how we engage with this without annoying people, because what we really want to do is have an intellectual conversation to expand what we see and to expand the skills that we have. And so teaching students how to harness their emotions when they're uncomfortable is where this pedagogy of discomfort comes from. Somewhere along the line, and I don't know where, there's this idea that's sort of fostered around everywhere that learning is always fun. And I'm not here to say learning can't be fun or that it shouldn't be fun. You know, I'm in the School of Education. Of course, I want things to be fun, but at the same time, having a conversation with students to say, well, actually, often learning new things is uncomfortable. And that's kind of where the magic happens. And so this is actually the conversation I have with my students day one of classes, and talk about the fact that this course, we're going to tackle difficult content and it's likely going to make you feel uncomfortable. And I actually talk to them about what a pedagogy of discomfort is. I actually give them a handout and I say exactly what we just opened with here. Have you ever heard any of these phrases in schooling? Have you ever heard any of these things? And the vast majority of people have. And I will say, how's that made you feel? And when you have these types of conversations, or when you hear these types of comments, how do you go about it? What do you do? Because the thing about education is that the vast majority of people have been through some type of education system. So they always feel like they can have a say. So everyone contributes to conversations about what good education is. And so a pedagogy of discomfort, as I guess, is changing or re-angling the conversation to think about discomfort as actually being very productive. And it's about learning how to harness it. And I really love the quote from Joanne Bowler that I put on that slide here. You know, when she talks about, I address defensive anger, fear of change, and fears of losing our personal and cultural identities. So an ethical aim of a pedagogy of discomfort is willingly to inhabit a more ambiguous and flexible sense of self. Because my course in my first years is all about getting them to take pause on what they think they know about education and expanding what they see. So the strategies I invoke, I have this conversation with them straight up that we're going to address difficult content and that we need to skill you in doing that. And I think probably one of the biggest take-home lessons I've learned along the way is setting the expectation for interacting and being and allowing it to be okay to feel uncomfortable, but learning how to harness it productively and, importantly, respectfully. So that means having some tools for managing challenging interactions and learning moments. So to put this into context, I actually asked my teaching team. So we have about 300 to 400 students in my course. It's one of the largest ones in our school. And I said, well, you know, so what are some of the, because I think we take it for granted. We're so used to being in this environment. And so I asked my teaching team, what are some of the things that, you know, you've been quite, you know, we've been shocked with what some of our students have said before that we almost have become blasé about. Some classic chestnuts are parents and kids from low socioeconomic backgrounds don't care about education. So when you have that comment made to you in a lecture or in a tutorial, how do you deal with that? I've also had comments along the lines of religious schools have a right to discriminate. Why should they be forced to change their beliefs and allow LGBTQIA+ people in their schools when they don't follow religious values? So, you know, so these are, you know, really challenging comments that we get in this course. And so it's really important for us as a team of teachers, because it's a large course, to have some type of scaffolding protocol from the word go. And then when these types of comments happen, to model using that process. And so the next slide, if you could, Tanya. This is the process I use with my students. And I, again, give this to them from day one. and I talk about what this is and what this looks like. And it's, you know, come from a couple of older sources, but they're really good. So we use the process of reflective skepticism, which is the sociology of ed term for it, which is basically a process for critical reflection. And so I say, when you make a claim, it's all about unpacking the assumptions that sit behind it. So it's also about understanding where you're coming from, so you can have a respectful dialogue with someone else who may not be bringing the same assumptions to the table. Then it's about having contextual awareness, which is saying, what's the socio-historical context from within which these types of comments have emerged? And then imaginative speculation is thinking, well, what are alternative arguments to these things? And then ultimately having your own informed opinion about that. And so if you could just move to the next slide for a second. So this is a bit wordy, but this is literally from the handout that I give them. And so I actually say, well, what are the assumptions that unpack, for example, if I get a comment of parents from low socioeconomic backgrounds don't care about education, what assumptions are you making? So I actually model the enactment of that process, because in this type of course, we will have varying points of view. And, you know, it would be unfair of me to be teaching this type of course without setting a model in place for how we navigate that. So this process of reflective skepticism, which is in essence a version of critical reflection, is how we go about doing that. Because in the context that I teach, inevitably my pre-service teachers will end up teaching in schools or higher education, and they will disagree. They will disagree with someone in the world about something else or an approach to a teaching issue. And how do you respectfully have those conversations? And so, you know, with my very short period of time, I'm cognizant, Tanya, I've only got a little bit left. We also try to set up protocols. I guess my take-home messages are protocols, and this is the one I use. And the second one is talking about how when you disagree or you learn something, it's uncomfortable and that's actually okay. And we go through a process of how we can harness that. And so they're probably my two tips and tricks in my short 10-minute little spiel about how I approach that kind of challenging domain in my classroom. So thanks.
I think there are some fantastic tips there that we can all take away and use. If anybody has any questions for Christina or for any of the presenters throughout today, please put them in chat or unmute and please ask. We've allocated a few minutes after each presenter for some questions and also then at the end of today's session. So if anybody has any questions, please, as I said, feel free to ask them. There's some already in chat.
I think I've got a couple here. Oh, where are we going? How far do I go back up? Sorry, I didn't know where time I started. Cancel culture, yes. Cancel culture nightmare, yes. Is it a good idea to draw attention to what defensiveness is? I think so. I think it's a good idea because defensiveness is also part of other emotions that can come along with that, such as anger. So if you are faced with information that clashes with your worldview and you feel uncomfortable, what is that uncomfortableness telling you? And so I try to teach the students that if you feel uncomfortable, what is it telling you methodologically about this situation? So is it because you have not had that lived experience? Is it because you actually disagree with the premise that they're coming from? And so you can actually have a dialogue about what sits behind your feelings. And so really get into the content. So look, I would say yes, it is good. Another one, what perspectives would you exclude? I've often found that there are certain points of view or perspectives that are harmful to discourse itself, but going about excluding these can be really tricky. Yeah, and I think, you know, my 2 bobs worth on that is that pedagogy, so the art of teaching, is exactly that. It's an art form, and I think it's really underrated in terms of how these difficult content is really, it's a skill to navigate it. I don't think you should shut down perspectives. I kind of take the philosophy of it being an educative moment. And so if a student is going to publicly say something, I will literally model that process of reflective skepticism and saying, well, that's really interesting that you have that. Tell me more about what assumption are you bring to the table to think that way? And I think you have to kind of own it and model it. Yeah. I think I'm out of time though, Tanya, am I? I'm not.
We might move on just because, and then come back. I'm sure there'll be some time for questions at the end. I think what we've presented is fantastic. Thank you so much. And I think there's a lot in there that people can take away and use as practice within their own teaching. So thank you very much for sharing. Chao Shi, can I call on you now to share what you're doing in the classroom and the challenging conversations that you've had and how you navigate and manage those, please?
Yep, thank you, Tanya, and thank you for Christina providing this very insightful discussion. I think our approaches have and our examples have some overlaps, and I think it's a nice connection that we're making here. So just to provide a bit of background, I'm a health sociologist and I teach social sciences courses in general across all levels, especially introductory and advanced health sociology subjects. So kind of similar to kind of Christina's cohort that she was just talking about, in health sociology and social sciences in general, we as educators encounter a very diverse of students in teaching and practice. In my example, where my students are mostly within the social sciences, for example, they might be coming from Bachelor of Social Sciences, Bachelor of Arts, and etc. similar fields. We also frequently get students from psychology, health sciences, allied health, and even medicine in our subjects as electives, of course. So this kind of creates interesting dynamic and interesting kind of power position in the student cohort, and not just within the student cohort, but with me as well. And brought by differences in ways of being and knowing as students who are equipped with and comfortable with different paradigms and different type of knowledge. And not to mention that students often come from very different personal, socioeconomic, and cultural backgrounds as well. Christina was just talking about, speaking about the pedagogy of discomfort. I think that's a really interesting point. And this kind of echoes the key arguments from kind of recent scholarly debates within higher education about the so-called safe space or the comfort space and the comfortable space. For example, this paper I'm referring to at the moment by Radusco Baker in 2018, they've offered discussion about this in terms of what a safe space actually means. So conventionally, safe space is understood as comfortable spaces for so-called all ideas being supported, being included, and without anyone being challenged. And educators are often expected to provide neutral and apolitical responses. And even though that's not kind of official requirement, and this is often internalized or internalized in practice. So when shifting to brave space, instead of a conventional kind of safe space in Radusco Baker's theorization, we must ask who we're asking to be brave, for whose or kind of whose bravery is or is not being recognized. Calling in those who have lived experiences to educate who make problematic claims can be quite unfair, and because it requires additional intellectual and emotional labor. And moving forward, instead of silencing them or leave these so-called problematic claims to be, we might want to start using problematic claims as educational opportunities. Based on kind of my observation, those problematic statements within the classroom, especially in sociological ones, they're often directed to, for example, individuals or certain groups of individuals and make these claims on a micro level. For example, I've heard in my classroom that claims about, and I quote, homeless people are just lazy, they just need to get a job when discussing the issue of housing. In sociology class, it is actually great to encourage students to think sociologically and beyond the individual and the micro, but also the structural and the macro level of issues. So I have used this current slide in some of the introductory health sociology classroom to set expectations of how I would step in and how would I be calling myself in as the brave instructor when dealing with so-called difficult conversations. If we could please move to the next slide, I'll use an example from my classroom, a kind of in a more advanced sociology classroom to illustrate how do I apply this kind of concept in my teaching. So this happened in one of the advanced health sociology workshops. At the point, there were about 15 students in the classroom, it's a relatively small class. A student, a male student from a science background, started this kind of comment when we were discussing gender inequality. So what he said was, I'm not too sure about the gender pay gap you just mentioned. I think the gender pay gap exists because women in general choose to participate in lower paying jobs. Clearly, we recognize that this is a statement that's not clearly very appropriate. But I want to point out there's several things to unpack here. So from the perspective of educator, this is a comment about gender equality or gender inequality, and it's clearly a question that lends itself to sociological thinking. Like the paper I've just introduced, instead of silencing this problematic statement, we can choose to consider it and address it as an educational opportunity. Although I adopt the approach of a modified brave space that calls myself as the instructor in, I do not shy away from the potential contributions from the students. As what Pablo Freire would say, that educators should not position themselves as the sole holder of knowledge. So in this situation, to start with, I do not start with exercising my authority as the lecturer, but I invited the class to see if they have anything in response. Many of the other students are from a humanities and social sciences background, and one of the students responded. She said, no, you will also need to consider other social aspects, but she did not continue to elaborate. And I think I saw a comment from Linda earlier in the chat about how to kind of avoid these kind of problematic comments to pile on once they initiate. And I acknowledge this is quite a small class, but I think that kind of educational philosophy of knowing when to step in can be really useful. And engaging with this kind of difficult conversation requires a heightened sensitivity here. Whilst I do not have the first person experience in this very particular topic, because I'm not a woman, I have the relevant expertise to illustrate this issue from a sociological instead of an individual perspective. And after the student's response to the initial claim, I went online and presented this infographic made by the Workplace Gender Equity Agency. And because I think it is important that materials or the evidence that we're showing that we use to address these difficult conversations, they need to be relevant and able to speak to the students' paradigm or their kind of zone or knowledge of comfort. In this case, I presented this infographic and a range of other resources that provided actual data about gender pay gap, how it impacts women, and this spoke to a paradigm, spoke in a way that student is comfortable and somewhat familiar with, considering their kind of scientific background and unfamiliarity with the social sciences in general. The kind of second thing I did was to return to the students and to list some of his assumptions embedded in this comment. And the student actually responded, said he has never thought about this before. He offered this comment purely because this is something that I have observed in the kind of pre-med program, one that is individually situated and specific to the kind of science and medical field, or very prevalent in the science and medical field. This then becomes a great opportunity for the student and the class to have a discussion about more specifically the gender inequality within the field of medicine and health sciences. And we ended up going into more details in terms of the challenges and barriers women face, in particular, to participate and succeed in such careers. Could we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. It is one thing to start and respond to these difficult conversations on the spot, but I think it's also important to sustain and engage students continuously in these conversations. So drawing on what, like Christina was talking about, the pedagogy of discomfort, I do so by attempting to shift the power positions that's underpinning the students' contributions, whether they're problematic or not. So in the course design, actually, I do, based on the relevant course content about women's health, later in the semester, I collaborated with and invited the students to the UQ Integrated Pathology Center. While social sciences students are in general not more familiar with the content and discussion that we engage with in class, it is important to also bring them discomfort through dispositional learning. And not only did this bring so-called discomfort to social science students, it also empowered and brings science students some comfort to showcase their expertise, so they feel safer and braver to engage during the class. In kind of a summary, that engaging students in difficult conversations is not only about educating them and lecturing or challenging their conceptions. It can sometimes also about appreciating their expertise. And instead of silencing this input, I think we need to engage them continuously. I think that's a really important point. And drawing on everyone's expertise in that room, the educators, students, their peers, and in many cases, the kind of material environment that we're situating. And we need to pay attention to this as the educator who designs these kind of environments. As instructors, we should not only be brave on a personal level to engage in these conversations, but also from a broader level of design, and also to prioritize the kind of continuous engagement in our teaching. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Xiaoxi. I think what you have presented is some fantastic ways that you have navigated some challenging conversations within the classroom, along with some very practical and real examples of what's happened, which I think many can relate to, perhaps not specifically that topic, depending on the content they're teaching within, but definitely we can all relate to that. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask Xiaoxi? Any questions about how he has gone through the process, or how he has managed different challenges?
I think I see one in the chat by Luke.
Yeah.
So it was, could you give an example of dispositional knowledge? I engaged with this concept a while before, so might be getting a bit rusty. But so you can see on this kind of slide is the kind of infographic I made for conference roundtable. The kind of dispositional knowledge I'm bringing here, or I kind of design here through a pathology museum or visit or field trip visit, to provide this kind of interdisciplinary exchange for both social science students and the science students, to expose them, especially the social science students in that case, to expose them to things that they're not necessarily familiar with, and to invite them to challenge their own assumptions, and to also learn from their peers who are not necessarily recognized as experts in social sciences classrooms. And I think this quite importantly serves the exchange of power dynamics within the student peers, because in that kind of field trip, what we actually observed is the social science students started to approach the science students actively and to learn from their expertise, because they have visited that space before. They have the expert knowledge in that kind of area.
Thank you. So Luke's come back and said it's a more clear metacognitive exercise.
I'm not quite clear in terms of a metacognitive exercise. Would you mind elaborate a little bit?
Luke, would you like to unmute and share?
Yeah, thanks. This is actually really fascinating. I'm really interested to see the way that you're going about it. I actually just am making sense of this from my own knowledge base, which is looking at their dispositions and getting them to think about their dispositions, which is thinking about thinking, which is metacognition.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we may come back to some more questions. So please, if you have any other questions or topics you would like to discuss, please add them to chat or keep them for a moment. One of the things that we acknowledge is that these conversations can be really hard. It can be really hard for teaching staff and it can be really hard for students. So how do we have these conversations, particularly if you're teaching into a subject where these conversations tend to take place on a very regular basis? What if you are teaching something that's controversial, or you've got a group of people who are bringing up controversial topics very regularly? How do you manage self-care in this space? Because it's important that one looks after ourselves. And when we're talking about self-care, we are not talking about scented candles and baths and all those kind of things. But I think self-care in this space is incredibly important. And so we're going to spend some moment talking about that. And when this session was coming together, we discovered that Nakia and Xiaoxi had some fantastic support that they were actively engaged with within the self-care concept that really helps them navigate these challenging conversations. So I'm going to ask them to both share what they do to ensure that they're able to continue these conversations in the brave spaces to ensure that everybody can grow and learn from the participation.
Thanks, Tanya. To give you a little bit of background, everyone, cultural mediators at the UQ Art Museum are a team of paid staff. We're all made up of students, and it's our job to mediate the experience of the artwork in the exhibition space with the participants that are coming in. And when I say participants, that's very intentional. Normally, art galleries and museums think of their publics as audiences, and we take a different approach and engage them in conversation. And that conversation isn't, how do I say, it's not a download of information about the artist and the artwork. It's very much, oh, hi, how you going? Welcome to the Art Museum. I can see that you're drawn to these artworks. Do you have any questions, or would you like to chat? So it's very much organized the other way around, which is quite different from other visitor engagement models. But to do that, we have had to scaffold into our mediation practice some very, very careful planning around self-care. You can see on the slide there, on your left-hand side, some of the tools that we use. So we have twice yearly paid reflection sessions. We have self-care planning updates with our supervisor, and that comes out of our self-care mediated plan. I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that there, that little booklet? So it's actually several pages long, and it has lots of space to respond to quite a number of different prompts. So they cover workplace self-care, work-life balance, and the booklet ranges from particular activities you can do to make sure that your self-care is prioritized at work and at home, creating boundaries, knowing what your triggers are, knowing how to communicate with your colleagues and your peers when you're triggered is very important for us as a mediator team. And then, of course, prioritizing well-being when you are triggered, and then getting into the nuts and bolts. So managing those difficult situations. We have a mediator support library that's full of, there's a digital one and a physical one too, so we can read up on areas that we're not quite sure of, like people from different cultural backgrounds, people from different ability backgrounds. So that's a really important thing, the resourcing. And then identifying the support within your community that you can access, whether that be building and communicating support within your team, or identifying where and when you need support. So for instance, the cultural mediation team identified that one of the exhibitions was bringing up a lot of questions around empathy and how to properly be empathetic. And we reached out to our team supervisor to say, hey, look, we feel like we need some training in this space. And we're very privileged to have a donor come on board and provide us with some money to actually train the team in empathy. So these kinds of things are very bespoke to the UQ Art Museum and to the mediator team, but there's some examples of ways that you might engage in your own practice, in your own self-care practice. So the little stretch of information, managing difficult conversations at the top right hand of the slide, that's a list of particular prompts that we have in our mediator reflection journals. We have these on us in the space when we're mediating. And if we need to, we can access these particular areas. We think of self-care as a proactive activity, meaning, yeah, if you set aside some serious time to be proactive about acknowledging where your personal boundaries are, figuring out what your triggers might be, getting on board on the same page with your supervisors and your peers inside your department or your faculty. These are all really, really useful things to make sure that your self-care is prioritized. If you could go to the next slide, Tanya. Maybe there was one before it. Oh no, that's all. That must be it. That's okay. I think it's, yeah, that's all good. I think it's Zhao Shi. Have you got that slide there?
Oh, no, I don't have slides. I think it's a kind of a resource slide after our, yeah.
Yeah,
So in
that's
terms
right.
of, yeah.
Go to the next one, Tanya. That's fine. Thanks, love.
Chelsea, could you, I know we're just cautious of time. We're meant to be finishing in 6 minutes. Chelsea, you had a really unique approach of what happens within your teaching space, because you're dealing with really sensitive topics all the time. Could you summarize that in 2 to 3 minutes? Of what do you do as a team?
Yeah, okay. So I think the first thing is to be reflexive, and in terms of knowing, and I think this is a great platform to see that these difficult conversations, they happen very frequently and they're very common. And one of the things we do at the School of Social Science, and we have a scholarship of teaching and learning cluster led by Linda Cheveller, who's in the audience now, I think. So I've been only able to attend 2 of these meetings, but one of the things we do in the cluster is to share those experiences and to think about how we deal with these things kind of collectively. And I think that's a great example of how we participate and we offer that kind of peer support to our peer educators, and to actively think about teaching and how to practice these kind of and how to transform these kind of concepts into practice, and also help each others to manage this kind of difficult conversations and provide our own insights in terms of how we could better deliver these in teaching. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. I have lots of questions about the self-care, but we're going to keep moving because the clock is not allowing us to continue the conversation. I think we could actually have this conversation for all day, but unfortunately we have an hour. So Amber, what are your recommendations should staff or students experience challenging conversations? They're difficult, they're uncomfortable. Where can they go for support?
Thank you, Tanya. And wow, thank you so much to our presenters. That was really insightful, and there's so much more we could do. So hopefully we'll come back to this topic again. I guess I've taken an initial approach of the more crisis or extreme end, and this, I guess, is more likely to happen after a class. So it's possible that you might have a student approach you in distress or having been triggered by a topic. I hope that doesn't happen to you, but I suspect that all of us on the front line of teaching have had an experience like this at some point. So a couple of places to start, including the website supporting a distressed student, I found quite practical and short to navigate, and a good one to maybe skim read, just so you're aware that there's supports in place if you have a student who's in distress and you're concerned about needing to do a little bit more. The counselling and crisis line is for everybody, staff and students, and again, that's in crisis mode. So I'm hoping most of us aren't there, but it's good to know that that number's available. And then really the other resources I've provided are just a taster of what's available. And for me, they were more about building our own awareness around identifying comments in classrooms that are problematic. I think particularly if we don't have a social science or education background, we're developing our own awareness of the kinds of things that students might say in a classroom that can cause problems. So developing our own understanding of the LGBTQI community and the challenges that they face by joining the Ally Network training. It's probably some of the best training I've done while working at university. There's lots and lots of modules on workplace. You may have already engaged with some of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander core competency modules. You might have just done the first 1 or 2, but that's something you might continue working on, carving out some time for. A new resource that some of you may already be familiar with is an open textbook. It's an interactive open textbook developed by Tracy Bunder and colleagues here at UQ with students as well. It was a partnership approach around the language of relationships. It's a very handy resource to dip into. You might even use some of those resources within your classroom conversations with students, or use it as a resource for students. So I'll leave it there. I am very confident there's a large number of people in this session today who have some other recommendations for places they might start. So feel free to share other resources if you've got them. Moving on to places you might refer students. If you have had a conversation with a student who's brought an issue to your attention and you want to ensure those students get follow-up support. Again, the My UQ Crisis Support link is a very nice, practical, straightforward place to jump into when you're thinking, gosh, I'm not sure what to do next to help this student. And it's got options for a person who's in crisis, a person who's supporting someone in crisis. Again, we're working here at the extreme end, and I hope that doesn't happen for you, but it's good to know it's there. Maybe in my exploration of the UQ resources, I found it's very disparate. So my advice as someone who's supported students in the past is just start somewhere. Reach out to one of these organisations or divisions or services at the university, and someone will get you and your student where they need to be for the right type of support. Be persistent there. It's a large organisation and sometimes we can feel like we're going around in circles on the internet, but absolutely there are a range of services that we can connect our students up to so they can continue to be supported. And again, if anyone's got some places they've reached out to support students, feel free to share them in the chat.
Thank you, Amber.
That's it. Thank you, Tanya.
I'd like to thank everybody for participating in this session, and I do hope that you're able to take some learnings away that you can include into your own teaching practice. And I'd like to have a huge thank you for our presenters today, Christina, Nikia, Chaoshi, and Amber. You've all shared some really important and practical tools that people can use. There's lots of questions and lots of conversations that we could continue within this space. But we do have limited time. There is a poll that you can all respond to, which gives us some feedback about how you would rate this session. This helps with us to understand the kinds of content that you would like in the future, whether this was meaningful, whether it's something you would like us to explore further. If you've got any further comments or feedback, feel free to include those in the poll. But thank you very much for everybody's involvement, and I hope that nobody needs to draw on the resources that Amber did use, and I'm apologising and sorry if anybody has had challenging conversations that have been upsetting, but thank you everybody, and I hope that we see you in future ready to teach sessions later this week. Thank you.